Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is A Year in the Life of a Polar Bear, the 2021 edition. And our presenter today is our wonderful expedition leader, Eleanor. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here today. We are thrilled to have you back and looking forward to hearing all of your knowledge about these polar bears. I'm going to turn it right over to you because I know we don't have enough time to cover everything. So go ahead and get started.
Thanks so much, Sunny. And you're right, there's never enough time to talk about polar bears. If any of you have had the opportunity to travel up and see Churchill's polar bears with natural habitat, you'll know that whether it was me or another one of our expedition leaders, we can talk for literally days on end about these animals. So today, what I'm hoping to do is introduce us to the polar bears, get through some basic bear facts, and take us through a year in the life of a polar bear. Before we hop into polar bears, just to introduce you to me, as Sunny said, I'm one of our expedition leaders here at Natural Habitat Adventures. My name is Eleanor Edye. I hope I've met some of you before, and I hope I'll meet some of you at some point in person in the future. I am one of our primarily Churchill-based guides. So I live in the same province where Churchill is located, the province of Manitoba in the country of Canada. And while right now I am not physically in Churchill, I will be again in just a couple of weeks. So it's very much a second home to me. I do guide our bear trips as well as our Northern Lights and Beluga trips. So I'm up in Churchill quite a bit of the year. As we get into some basic bear facts, before I start talking about the year in the life of a bear or the basic bear facts, I just want to give a quick plug to tomorrow's presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about a year in the life of a bear, and I will touch on reproduction and polar bear cubs, but tomorrow you have a whole other presentation on polar bear cubs. So come on back for Eddie Savage's presentation tomorrow as well. If you're interested in polar bears, I guarantee there will be some more good polar bear time tomorrow as well. So a little bit about the polar bear as we get going. Scientific name for the polar bear is Ursus maritimus, meaning the maritime bear. And the global population estimates for the polar bear is somewhere between 22 and 31,000. So there's always a range that we have to give. These are always estimates because we can't go out there and count every single polar bear in the world. You'll usually see 25,000 as the global population estimate for bears. And we're pretty confident that 25,000 is a good middle of the road number. Where polar bears came from, let's just take a step back here and think about what these bears are doing on the ice. They're the only bear that's, as far as we know, that has ever existed that is evolved for life on the sea ice. And this image here is the extant bears of the world, meaning not extinct, right? They are currently living. We have 8 extant bear species on the planet right now, these being all the ones you can see here. And this image here is something called a cladogram. So it shows you the relative distance of the genetics between all these separate bear species. So if you look at the left-hand side bear, the giant panda, we can see that when we look at that splits, it almost looks like a tree with funny branches, that the giant panda is further away from any other bear species. So it is very much a bear that sits alone by itself. It's still considered to be a true bear. It still belongs to the bear lineage, but it's very, very genetically different from all the other bears. On the far right-hand side of this image, we can see the 2 bears that we think are the most closely related, this being the polar bear and the brown bear. So if the giant panda is the one that's furthest away from everything else, the polar bear and the brown bear are the ones that are most closely linked together in terms of their genetics. And while we don't have an agreed upon number for how long those 2 species have been separate, we can estimate anything between 100,000 years to about 1 million years, but probably somewhere in the middle. There is some good evidence that we should think about it as being a longer split, so at the longer end of that time frame, but we don't have conclusive evidence one way or the other at this point. There's some issues that we may never be able to tease out because polar bears and brown bears are able to interbreed. And every time you have an interbreeding event, it mucks around with how we can track back those genetic differences between species. But takeaway from that is that the polar bear is a relatively recent species, and it's very much the newcomer on the bear scene of the world. Now, these two bears that we can see in this image here, they may look like a polar bear and a grizzly bear, but in fact, these are both brown bears. So I just dropped the word grizzly in there, and we may think of grizzly bears and brown bears as being the same thing. Brown bears refers to the whole group of brown bears found worldwide. Grizzly bears are those found inland in North America. So sometimes you'll hear people, including me, just drop the word grizzly in there like it's the same thing as a brown bear. Grizzlies are just a subset of brown bears. But these bears here, they are both grizzly brown bears. But as we can see, whether it's a black bear or whether it's a brown bear, anything that we're describing by color, we do have variability in what that color can present as. So brown bears can be blonde, like this one on the left here. Brown bears can be brown, like this one on the right. They can also be almost reddish. They can be grayish, bluish. They have a whole range of color variations. We know with the black bear, some of you may have heard of the spirit bear of the west coast of Canada. It's a white black bear that's found along the west coast and occurs at a rate of, I think it's around 1 in about 300 bears that's born there, and it is a natural mutation. These are all normal variation in coloration. So if we step back in time to when there were definitely no polar bears, we think that there were still likely at that point brown bears that may have had a whiter color patterning, and that perhaps a population of brown bears that became isolated from other bears during a high ice event. So when the earth was cooler, there was lots of ice that pushed down from the North Pole and up from the South Pole, and it isolated a population of brown bears, that these bears evolved using the genes that they already had access to being white bears that were adapted to the sea ice and were able to better hunt animals like seals who weren't as able to see them and weren't looking really for a bear that might have been hunting them. And just over time, natural selection would have favored those with light colored coats. Now, of course, that's very much a simplification. There's a lot of research that's been done on this and a lot of research still ongoing with this, but this is how we can start to think about where polar bears may have come from. Polar bears, as we know them now, are extremely specialized to life on the sea ice. And they have a number of evolutionary features that aren't found in other bears that allows them to support their life on and off the ice. And I'll be pointing these out as we go through a year in the life of a polar bear. Now, as I mentioned before, we have somewhere between 22,000 and 31,000 polar bears found globally, with a baseline estimate of around 25,000 we think is about right. They are found across the world in 5 different countries, these being the US, so Alaska, right? Canada, most of Canada's north is polar bear habitats. We have Denmark, which is represented here by Greenland, because Greenland does support populations of polar bears. We have Norway, because of the island of Svalbard that's found quite far north. It also supports a population of bears. And Russia, also having polar bears. They do occasionally pop up elsewhere. Once in a while, you hear of a polar bear rafting down to Iceland or something like that. But for the most part, we find these bears very reliably only in these 5 nations. Of that global population of 25,000 bears, we know that about 16,000 are found within the borders of Canada. And those 25,000 bears, we can divide it up into what are known as subpopulations. So polar bears have 19 recognized subpopulations. These are mostly used for management purposes. So it's always really helpful for humans to know what's a general group of bears, how do we manage them? If bears start to decline in this area, does it mean that a big group of bears is starting to decline? Does it mean that just this little group of bears is starting to decline? So this is supported scientifically. We know that when we look at the bears found in these regions here within these subpopulations, they are more likely to stay in those areas, to mate with bears who are also found in these areas, than they are with bears found outside those areas. But of course, while humans like to draw straight, firm lines on maps, polar bears don't read these maps like we do. Polar bears do move around. These are fuzzy lines. Like I said, more used for management than used for an actual bear deciding where it's going to live. Now, something to keep in mind as we look here, when we look at where these bears can be found, they are found generally in coastal areas. So bears like the areas where sea ice isn't too thick and where we are on top of what's called a continental shelf. So if we drained all the water away from the oceans, we would see that around the continents of North America and Asia, that there was a shallow area. These areas are generally quite productive in terms of fisheries. So they're used by humans for fish. They're also used by seals for fishing too, and therefore used by polar bears. When we get into the areas that are deeper, like through the Arctic basin, where it gets quite deep, and there's less productivity, fewer fish, fewer seals, these are not considered to be good polar bear habitat regions. While bears will often transit through those areas, we know that bears don't really go anywhere that they can't eat, just like you or I wouldn't go anywhere that we couldn't eat. There are some bears that will live their entire lives on the sea ice, and as the name Ursus maritimus tells us, the maritime bear, these are maritime animals. However, some bears that live in areas of seasonal ice cover where the ice fully disappears every summer will either move onto land for the summer to use it during the ice-free season, or those bears may actually migrate further north and remain on the ice during the winter. So wherever that ice disappears, bears obviously have to go somewhere else. They're not spending their summers swimming around in the water. Now, one thing I'll just point out here is that this is a relatively recent map from WWF. This is current as of 2019, and it shows us not just the populations of polar bears, but also what their trends are in terms of their population numbers. I just wanted to point out where the Western Hudson Bay population is. The Western Hudson Bay population, if you look at the lower left-hand side of the map, there's two red squares together, like squares, squarish things, rhomboids. The one on the left-hand side, there's the Western Hudson Bay population, and that is where the town of Churchill and the Churchill Bears are located. So that was your brief little introduction to a little bit of the general biology and population ecology of polar bears. Let's start going through a year in the life of a bear. Because I know for me, anytime I've moved somewhere, I always feel like you can't really understand a place fully until you've been in it for a full year. And I think the only way to really understand any kind of organism, whether it's a bear or whether it's a small plant living on the ground, you have to look at their entire year in the life so that you can see all the challenges and all the things that they are going through to fully understand what the life of that animal is like. And I want to start in spring. Not because it's springtime right now, because it's not, but because spring is really, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important times in a polar bear's life. Primarily because it is a time of plenty, and it is the most important time for almost every bear out there to get its needed calories. Now, this image here that you can see, I know that it's springtime. How can you know that it's springtime? Well, one thing I can see that bird circling around in the top right-hand corner there, that's a glaucous gull. Glaucous gulls will migrate up towards the Arctic in the spring, and they actually follow along behind polar bears and scavenge bear leftovers. So I know right away that this is a springtime picture of this bear. When is spring if you're a bear? Spring is probably anywhere between, well, you know, late February into well into May. What makes spring spring is some of the different things that are happening around the ecosystem at this time. The most important thing that's happening in the spring that affects polar bears is nothing specifically to do with the polar bears themselves, but it is to do with the primary prey species of the polar bear. This image here is a ringed seal. The ringed seal is the smallest of all seal species. It is the most common seal in the Arctic, and it is the species most often eaten by a polar bear. Now, ringed seals are not the only things that polar bears live on, but it is what most bears eat most of. Polar bears also eat walrus, they eat harp seal, hooded seal, harbor seal, narwhal, bowhead when they can get it, beluga when they can get it. They'll even scavenge off other polar bear carcasses. They tend to eat whatever is available to them, but ringed seal is quite definitely the biggest source of calories for polar bears. Now, on the left-hand side there, you can see the population distribution of those ringed seals. And if you mentally recall what the population distribution of polar bears was, it is basically the exact same. You find ringed seals, you find polar bears. They just go together. And it's going to be more or less a one-for-one correlation there. Now, I said ringed seals were fairly small, the smallest of all the seal species of the Arctic. They're about 4 feet long at maturity. You can see looking at that one on the right, there's quite a bit of blubber on them. So that seal might be anywhere between 110 to 150 pounds at maturity. For your average bear, they need to eat 43 ringed seals per year to make a living. Seems pretty reasonable, actually, if you're a polar bear. And these seals are hunted anytime that they can. In most cases, that is when there is ice to hunt from. A seal can always outswim a polar bear in the water. Unless you've got a very stupid seal, a seal can almost always get away from a polar bear on the coast, for example, in the summer. We've seen it happen when you've had a lucky bear that gets to take a seal in the summer that's just been up on a rock sunning itself, but that is a seal. I'm sorry, seal, that didn't deserve to live. That was being very, very stupid. But in the springtime, they are hunting not necessarily the mature adults of the ringed seals, but they are actually hunting the ringed seal pups. Now, ringed seals are obviously kind of hard to hunt, right? So they're found underwater, they're marine mammals who swim, but come the springtime, what's going to happen is that they are going to go through their birthing period. So ringed seals don't pop on top of the ice like some other seals do. If you've ever seen a picture of a harp seal who have those very white, fluffy seal pups, those harp seals pop right on top of the ice. Easy pickings if there's a polar bear around. There often aren't. Harp seals are usually outside the range of a polar bear. But ringed seals, they have to carve out a den for themselves on the sea ice. So they go, this is the sea ice, and here's the snow that's blown around on top of the sea ice. They will actually excavate a hole out of that snow, so they are on top of the ice, but underneath the snow, and give birth within that layer. Now, if you're a polar bear, your job is to go around and pick up as many of those little blubber cookies as you can. When ringed seals are born, and this is sometime in February, March, into early April, they're born around 10 pounds in size, and they are weaned 6 weeks later at 50 to 60 pounds. So in that 6-week period, they're putting on 40 to 50 pounds, of which about 75% of that weight gain is fat. So if you're a polar bear and you're looking for those calories and you're trying to get as many of them as you can, what do you want? You want easy, you want fast, you want plentiful. you are going for those seal pups. And it is estimated that about 1 in every 2 seal pups that are like ring seal pups that are born in any given year will be predated by a polar bear. So there's about 5 million seal pups, not 5 million ring seals worldwide. Not quite half of those will give birth. Not quite half of those will be eaten by a bear at some point. So it's a hard life as a ring seal. And polar bears, they are well-designed killing machines. I think of ring seal pups in the springtime every year because I think about this image that you can see right now and think about how this plus some snow falling down in your face as a polar bear breaks into your birthing layer is probably the last thing that a good number of ring seal pups see just a few weeks or days after birth. So for the record, this is a tranquilized bear, not a shot bear, anything like this. This bear is undergoing some research and is being satellite collared and has been tranquilized so it can be measured before being allowed to go free again. So it gets you a really good shot of those teeth. So they have about 42 teeth that are just designed to grab, to crush, to tear through seal flesh. Like other bears, the polar bear technically is an omnivore because they do consume berries, they do consume kelp, but for calories, they rely completely on meat, specifically on fat. And in fact, those front teeth that you can see there, incisors, when you have a bear who's in good shape and it's captured a nice fat seal, they're just going to use those teeth to just peel the fat, that blubber layer off that seal to just consume the blubber. In most cases, that muscle is actually left behind for the scavengers that come behind, like that glaucous skull that I was pointing out in that image earlier, which is a common sight on the sea ice in the springtime, as well as the other very common scavenger of polar bears, the Arctic fox. And I just had to throw this picture in. Not that it's specifically to do with polar bears, but it's to do with the polar bear ecosystem. And I think it's just so cool. So this is an iceberg just off the coast of Labrador. So Newfoundland and Labrador is on the east coast of Canada. In 2018, this fox was spotted by a crab fishing boat around 7 kilometers offshore, and they couldn't figure out how to rescue this poor fox. So it goes to show you, Arctic foxes make a lot of their living in the springtime as well as through the winter, following behind polar bears and scavenging off their carcasses. And every so often you get a fox who leaves it just a little bit too long and they can become trapped like this. So this fox was rescued and rehomed back to land. But leaving the foxes behind, as fun as they are, because I think we could speak for another couple of days just on foxes. The other thing that happens in springtime, besides just the feeding, is breeding. It is the only time of year that bears are likely to be in the same place at the same time, because if you think about the 25,000 bears over a huge area, we don't think that it's very likely that bears interact too often when they are out on the sea ice. But come the springtime, when those seal pups are being born, they're not being born in random areas. They are born along generally the coastline in pressure ridges that form along where the sea ice pushes up against the land-fast ice. So it is a time when you are likely, if you're a male who's out there looking for a mate, that you are more likely to run into a female in estrus than you would be any other time of the year. So it's a good time for mating to occur simply because bears are in the same place at the same time. Now, this image that you can see right now looks like it might be a male and female fighting, and I don't know what you're thinking, but this is actually a male and male. This can be hard to tell at a distance, quite hard actually. I know it's a male and male because I can look at them. Specifically, the one on the right is a really good mature big male. You can see how large he is. You can also see long hairs on the forelegs. We call those guard hairs. And we see those on mature male bears. This bear on the right is making it especially easy for us though, because when I look between his back legs, I can see the money shot, as it were. You can see the guard hairs coming off the penis in this case. So easiest way to sex a bear is getting a look at their genitalia, just like any other animal. And this one is telling us very clearly that that is a male. So males go through very, very fierce competition for access to mates. Fights between males are rarely fatal, but it can cause lifelong scarring, and it can cause tooth and jaw injuries as well. So males and females are both sexually mature around the age of 6, and females will start to produce cubs more or less as soon as they're big enough to do so. Males, because they have to fight for access to females, usually don't become successful at siring cubs until age 10 or older. Now, the reason for this is that a female polar bear, if she's a successful mother, she will have her cubs, she will nurse her cubs, she will nurse her cubs a second year, and she won't wean her cubs until they're around 2.5 years old, meaning that for that 2.5-year period, she is not available or interested in breeding at that point. So on average, for every one female that you have who's in estrus and available and receptive for mating, you've got 3 males. So it is very fierce, tight competition for that access to mating. Now this next photo is a male and female, and it gives you a good sense of that size difference between the male and female, because this competition for access to mates on behalf of the males has led to some pretty extreme sexual dimorphism. So males can range between around 800 to up to 1,500 pounds, whereas females are more like between 350 to 550 pounds, though they can get quite a bit larger when they fatten up before they go into their maternity den. Now, once that male has found the female, defended access to the female, they will stay together about 2 to 3 weeks, and they will mate repeatedly through this time, usually several times per day. So during this time, that male has to be able to control access to that female from any other contenders that might come along. That means that you really need the biggest, strongest male in the immediate area is going to be the only one who gets to keep access to that female. And the reason he's got to maintain that access through that 2 to 3 weeks is because females, while they may be in estrus, are not what we call spontaneous ovulators. So humans, for example, are spontaneous ovulators. We don't control when it happens. It just happens on a regular basis. Polar bears do not ovulate until they have been repeatedly mated. So they'll mate a few times, an egg gets released. Mate a bunch more, a few days later, a second egg might be released. So this means that if you have another male who comes along and pushes the first male off and then continues to mate with that female, if she has twins or triplets, they may actually have different sires. Now, one of the really interesting things that happens in bear biology happens right after the mating event. So just like any other animal, right, you got the egg and the sperm, and they come together, they do their thing, and they're going to go through a number of divisions to take us up to the blastocyst stage. So a very, very small, not yet an embryo, but 64 cells. Once the cub-to-be reaches that blastocyst stage, which really happens within that first day post-mating, that blastocyst is going to go into a state of suspended animation and is going to remain free-floating in that mom's uterus. So if, when we get along to the time when it needs to implant, if she has not got sufficient body fat storage to carry a pregnancy to term, that blastocyst or the multiple blastocysts are just going to abort and be resorbed into her body. So it's a very, very tidy system and nothing is wasted. Now, moving out of the spring, so as we move through the spring now, we've eaten all the seal pups that we could. We've got some very, very fat bears rolling off the ice if it's been a good year for that spring hunt. And they're just going to waddle their way onto land if you're in Churchill, or further north if you're in a population that remains on the ice through the summer. Now, I love this picture here. This is one of my favorite bears that I saw in the summer. This isn't my image. It's taken by a photographer up in Churchill. This is what we would call an obese female bear. And when we talk about obesity in bears, it doesn't have the same implication that it does in humans. An obese bear, you look at this bear and you're like, that is a nice looking bear. That is exactly how I want all my bears to look. So this bear came off the ice in late July. So summertime means no more ice, is what we mean by summertime. And when that can be is anywhere from in the Churchill area, late June through to mid-August. So this bear has had a very, very good spring hunt. She has killed and eaten many, many, many seal pups. She has put on a lot of fat storage. So remember I said that females can be up to about 550 pounds. They can actually be up to about 1,000 pounds during their hyperphagus period when they're eating like crazy at this point. That fat layer that she's got can be up to about 5 inches thick, and it's mostly concentrated over the bum, like over the hips, and the gut. Though this one being as big as she is, she's got fat storage happening everywhere. And I can tell you, having seen this bear, she was not a happy camper in the summer temperatures. She could get up. She didn't want to get up. She could move. She didn't want to move. Mostly what she did is sit there and pant whenever it got hot. But all that fat she's carrying around, it's not insulation, right? It is insulating her. It's keeping her hot. In this case, it's keeping her uncomfortable. But mostly what it's being used for is it's like putting leftovers in your fridge. She can't carry her leftovers around. She has to carry them on her body. So all of that fat storage is going to be used to support her through the summer. And in fact, if this is a pregnant female, which we strongly suspect it is, she's then going to use those extra fat stores to supplement her cubs feeding as well. Now, bears do remain on the ice as long as there is ice to be had. So I've been up in Churchill many a springtime and have seen the belugas come in sometime in June or July. The females with the cubs will tend to leave the ice before the males do. And there can still be usable ice in Hudson Bay well into August for these bears. Now, females, especially with cubs, they start to get antsy around that 50% ice coverage mark. So this picture here that I'm going to throw up is actually still considered pretty good habitat if you're a polar bear. So there's a lot of water, a lot of ice flows bumping around, but overall, there's still much more ice than there is water. She and her cubs can still hop from ice floe to ice floe. Seals still have to come up and they can hunt them from the ice. This is still very much when bears are going to be out on Hudson Bay using the ice. Now, in terms of when ice breakup happened in 2021, it wasn't as good for the bears as it was in 2020. 2020 had a nice late breakup for them. But just to throw up an image here, I've got from 2021, we're looking at an image here of Hudson Bay, and each of those colored specks within Hudson Bay is a bear with a collar on it, so we can get locations from those collared bears. The first bear who came on shore in 2021 was July 5th. So a little bit earlier than we would like, not crazy early, not crazy late. It's very different from what would have been considered normal in the 1990s when bears would come off the ice well into August. For example, in 1992, to pick a year, the average arrival date off the ice was August 15th. So looking now at early July being when bears are coming off, it does represent more reserves that they need to be able to pull from their body during that time that they are on shore. So the picture coming up here just shows you what the ice cover was like at that time that the first bear moved off. So this is Hudson Bay, and you can see some swirly clouds, but mostly what you can see in Hudson Bay there is actually the ice. So it's not on the west side of the bay. The ice is remaining here on the south and the eastern portions of Hudson Bay. So it's quite visible, and obviously if you're on the west side, there's no ice for a bear to have there, but bears will tend to follow along with whatever ice is left until it's so thin that they can't use it anymore. Now, The average in 2021, the average time that bears came on shore was July 19th. So at that point, half the bears were on shore. Looking at this image here where the satellite collars were, you can actually see the ice is marked off as well. So the blue color on your map, like for Hudson Bay there, is the water. But if you can see kind of along the southern edge of Hudson Bay, there's some lighter colored blue, and there's a couple of those bears showing there as well. So that is the remaining ice. And it is normal that that is some of the last remaining ice down along the southern coast, close to the province of Ontario there. Some bears just hang on to that ice as long as possible. Some bears come off when there's still ice kind of closer to their preferred areas, often closer to the Churchill area. So when we saw that first bear coming off in early July, those bears got to, it's almost like hopping off the bus closer to your home, so that you don't need to walk as far, even if the bus still has a seal party happening on it. Maybe you don't want to walk as far getting off that seal party bus. So something to note here as we're looking at those collared bears for 2021 in the summer, you can see that there aren't that many points because COVID limited the ability of scientists to travel up in 2020. There actually are very, very few collared bears that were out through the summer of 2021 because there were no additional collars put out in 2020. That's why we have fewer data points to work with from this year here. Now, they are bears of the ice, but they are able to swim. So just to give you an idea what those feet look like as they're moving through the water, as well as on the ice. I love these pictures. They just give you such an idea. They look so small and cuddly, right? They look adorable, but they are huge, huge paws. They're up to 12 inches across. They have claws that are like ice picks. And as we like to say, you can see that boat image on the left-hand side there. That was from this past year. And that bear, if it came close enough to the boats, could have gotten into the boat very, very quickly. So boat operators are always watching for making sure that they're not getting so close to a bear that they could put on that rush of speed and pull themselves out. Because bears are very easily able to swim long distances, grab onto an ice floe and pull themselves up out of the water and onto the ice in what feels like a split second. And they can certainly do it onto a boat as well. Now, while we see some bears swimming around through the summer, mostly what bears are doing through that summertime is resting. On average, a bear that's spending time on land loses about 1 kilogram of body fat every day, or about 2.2 pounds. The less they move, the less energy they have to put out, the longer they can conserve those fat stores to get them through until when the ice is back. Now, as bears come off the ice, we know that some bears come off early, some bears come off late, and they kind of bump around, almost like little ping pong balls until they figure out where they want to be. Females with cubs tend to come off early, so they're often some of the first bears we see back on land, but then they tend to move away from the coast to stay away from males that are coming off as well, because males can actually be a threat to cubs. Some of them are known to predate on cubs. They will feed through the summer opportunistically on things like goose eggs, on berries, sometimes on kelp. If they find a carcass, like if a stillborn beluga whale calf washes up on shore, they're sure going to eat it. They are able to run pretty fast on land, up to about 25 miles per hour, but they do overheat quickly, especially through the summer when they're carrying all that extra fat on their bodies. Really, like I said, summer is just going into that holding pattern and waiting for fall. And fall to a bear is that first scent of ice formation happening on the wind. Fall, if you've ever looked at our catalog, or if you've ever looked at really anybody's catalog about the best time and place to come up and see polar bears, fall is when we target as our best viewing opportunities for bears. Because this is when the bears start to congregate on the shores of Hudson Bay, waiting for the ice to form. And we know that as the ice forms, it tends to form from areas like Churchill first. So this animation may be kind of chunky because sometimes the program doesn't do it well, but as Hudson Bay ice is over, while the last ice was kind of along the southern edge of Hudson Bay, and that's where a lot of bears got off, most of the time, the first ice starts on the westernmost side of the bay. So that means if you're a polar bear, that while you might get off the ice along the southern or the eastern side of Hudson Bay, if you want to be first on the ice, you want to be eating as soon as possible, you're going to make your way back towards the west and likely towards the Churchill region, because you know that the first ice is likely to form right around there. Now, around the end of September, September 30th is actually when we tend to look at for the minimum sea ice coverage. So beyond September 30th is when sea ice starts to accumulate again. This year, what we saw, again, we got Hudson Bay here. You can see all those very bright colors on the water. And what this is showing us is what the temperature anomaly was in Hudson Bay this year, in this case in mid-November. So this isn't showing us what the temperature of Hudson Bay was. It's showing us how it departed from the average. So this particular year, it was actually a great year for bear viewing because temperatures got steadily cooler and cooler. It was warmer than normal, but not ridiculously warmer than normal for the most parts. But for a variety of reasons, the temperature of Hudson Bay started off quite a bit warmer than average, which meant that even as the air was cooling down and bears were coming and getting ready for the ice hadn't actually yet formed. So we saw a lot of bear activity this year in our viewing areas and in the wildlife management area. We saw a lot of other wildlife. We had some relatively normal, but still fairly mild temperatures, relatively speaking here. It's still Churchill, it's still the north. And as of December 1st, that is when we saw our first bears leaving the Churchill region to go onto the ice that did finally form. So whereas in some previous years, it's always a toss-up about when that ice is going to form enough that the bears will just leave land and go onto the ice. Some years, and historically it's been as early November if we go way back. Last year, it was mid-November. This year, the very first bear that we had monitored didn't leave until December 1st. So it was what we would call a later than normal freeze up. Good for us viewing the bears, less good for the bears. But I'll say that these bears overall looked pretty good when we were seeing them. We saw a lot of activity among the bears because, as I noted, the temperatures actually weren't that warm. Often when it's warm, bears are not really willing to move because they can overheat quickly. So we don't see them being very active, doing sparring or playing behavior until those air temperatures drop cooler. Sparring is one of those cool activities that you can see in the fall that you can't see any other time. Remember how I said that springtime was mating time, and this is when male bears are all up in each other's faces trying to get access to females. Well, now we're 6 months out from that. We're as far away from the springtime as you can get. The males will actually have their testes ascend back up into their abdominal cavity. So their testosterone levels are low, low, low. They can be around other bears without wanting to fight to the death. And in fact, they can be around other bears and actually get chances to play and hang out because they don't have that same urge to fight for access to females. So we see this a lot with mature male bears, but this year I thought was really interesting. We saw it happening with some younger bears as well. And this is one of the cooler things that I personally saw this year, was that we had a lot of bears just hanging around in larger numbers and larger agglomerations than we've seen for quite a while. So these, I don't think I've ever taken a picture with 5 bears all in one frame. Let's just start off by saying that. These are all subadult bears who just kind of arrived in the area, decided they were all best friends forever, or at least until the ice came, and they spent days and days just playing with each other, running around and wrestling. So this was here getting into mid-November at this point, or early November at least, very typical weather that you can see. very cloudy. In this case, I think sunrise wasn't until around 8 o'clock, so we're just before sunrise here, which is why it's a little bit dark, but so much behavior amongst those bears and so much activity happening. I know that for a lot of us guides, what really gets us up in the morning is being able to go out there and see all the ways that bears get to be bears with other bears in their natural environment. And we sure saw a lot of that this past year. These kind of wrestling behaviors that these bears were showing, they would pair up, they would go at it in groups of 3. They spent a lot of time wrestling with each other, and very interesting behavior to see. Something else that we see a lot in the fall is mothers and cubs coming down to wait for the ice to form as well. Moms and cubs will remain quite wary through, well, all the way around the year of other bears, especially big mature male bears. So this image here isn't from this year, it's from a couple of years ago, but I like it because it shows you all the mom in the middle and her cubs on either side just looking. And I can tell you what she was looking at. She was looking at a big male bear who was approaching, and they were all so wary and so aware of what that bear was doing. And as he approached closer, those bears just hightailed it right out of there. They were getting themselves out of that area and out of that risk. Now, this past polar bear season, we had fewer big male bears than I've seen for quite a while. But what that meant is that we actually had more females with cubs who spent time in the wildlife management area than we've seen for a while as well, including this next image here was 2 sets of moms with their cubs who spent some time just hanging out, even like with the cubs playing together. The mothers got nose to nose. And they were of course being aware of any big male bears around, but because those risks didn't exist at this point, we got to see what it looked like when 2 sets of mums and cubs got together and how long they would stay together. And they did hang out for a while. They split up, they came back together at one point. Something of note this year was that we saw primarily what we would call yearlings, so cubs who were already 1.5 years old. Didn't see too many of those cubs of the year, those smaller bears. And I didn't personally see any twins, but I think there was a report of twins that came out a little bit later in the season. So there were lots of mums and cubs, but they were primarily single cubs. We got to see them moving around and interacting with each other, including interacting with some of those sub-adults that we saw before too. Really a really interesting year for all of those different behaviors and interactions that we got to see. Now, during the fall, if you're a female who's pregnant and you wake up one day and you go, yeah, I think I'm pregnant, remember that that mating happens in the spring and then that blastocyst just hangs out. If their body has enough fat to support a pregnancy, that blastocyst will then implant and she will get the urge to move inland to go into a maternity den. I don't want to get too into the cubbing because I know Eddie is going to talk about it tomorrow, and I know he's going to do a great job on it. The mums need to have sufficient fat stores, around 200 pounds per pregnancy, for it to be successful, because those mums will need to spend up to about 240 days straight fasting while they are gestating, while they're nursing their cubs, before they get a chance to eat again. So this is a polar bear maternity den that you can see here before it's covered up by snow. And I'm going to leave that right there so Eddie can pick this up tomorrow. Most of the bears that we have in the Churchill area den in Wapusk National Park, and they den fairly far inland to where there is sufficient peat to excavate that, that maternity den. Now, to show you what we were looking at for this year, remember I said how December 1st was actually the first day that we had a bear out on the ice. Well, this is the most recent snapshot of where those collared bears are right now. So this is just a few days old, from December 17th. And you can see that the ice cover is, again, that lighter blue color on the left-hand side. There is a fair bit of ice to the west of Hudson Bay and along the southern coast. The east side of Hudson Bay remains completely open. But as Hudson Bay continues to ice over, those bears are just going to move across it like a wave. And you can also see that now that we've gotten through another year, that we have more collars that have been deployed. So there are more bears out here giving us more data now. Now, as of December 17th, just a few days ago, there were a few bears still on land, like December 17th, and there's still a few bears on land. It's kind of incredibly late in some ways, but good news for the bears is that they can now be out if they want to be out. There is sufficient ice out there to be out there hunting, going out and being a polar bear on the sea ice. Interesting points. This is the first year that we're going to be getting good data from polar bear males. Those purple dots on the map is a brand new program that's been put forward by Polar Bears International and supported by the 3M, the adhesive company. They developed a special adhesive to put tags on male bears, and they are deploying a number of them this year. And we'll just see how long they last through the winter. Through the winter, like I said, as the ice comes across and moves across Hudson Bay, this is taken from last year, but it just goes to show you how far they do disperse on the sea ice. Each individual bear will have its own territory and distance, but as they go out, what they are looking for is to go hunt, not the ring seal pups now, but they're now hunting the ring seal adults. It's no good day to be a ring seal, I'm afraid. There's always a polar bear trying to eat you. They don't catch as many in the winter as they can in the spring, but they're still able to hunt them at the intersection of the ice and the water, where the seal has to come up to breathe, and the bear can then intercept that seal and catch it and eat it. Hunting success is often quite low. Only around 10% of those attempts are successful, but that's good enough to keep those bears going. And like we said earlier, the average bear needs around 43 seals on average to eat. So here's an image of a polar bear hunting. I know it doesn't look very dramatic. Often a polar bear hunting is just a polar bear lying down at a seal's breathing hole until a seal pops up. Polar bears don't often stalk. They don't often do dramatic hunts. They just sit there and wait until something comes to them. So just to show you what their fur looks like as well, how do they stay warm when they're just hanging out there on the ice for so long? Well, they have incredible fur. The fat insulates them somewhat, but it's mostly the hair. They have a double layer of hair with an undercoat, as well as guard hairs. Those hairs are hollow to help trap air, similar to a deer hair. We'll do that as well. Most of their heat loss is actually through their feet and their muzzle, because elsewhere they are just too well insulated to lose any heat. Now, just to continue giving you a little teaser for tomorrow, I just wanted to throw a polar bear cub photo at you because that's what they look like when they're newborn, and they emerge from their dens in the springtime as small bears, but still able to move around. So this brings us back to springtime, when that poor mama bear who came off the ice in July or August, fasted through August, September, October, November, December, January, February. So we're at 8 months now, and she hasn't eaten. And now this mom here has a couple of cubs that she's had to gestate and nurse. Their goal now is to get their cubs safely out to the sea ice in time to intercept the seal pupping time again. So they've got to go out and get all those lost calories back and start feeding those pups again, or those cubs again as well, feeding the pups to the cubs. It's really critical that they get their calories back. And those cubs will follow along behind mama and learn everything there is to know about hunting seals from her. So with that, we've come all the way back around to springtime, and I'd love to toss it over to Sunny for any questions that have come in.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I learned a few new things along the way, as did our participants. Lots of questions already, but if anybody would like to submit a question, please do via your questions field in the control panel. But let's start with one that sort of refers to geography. Looking at the map you showed, it appeared as though there was larger populations in, I might pronounce this incorrectly, but the Chukchi Sea. Why does not have go to Churchill? What are the unique features that that make Churchill stand out as a great place, or maybe, in my opinion, the best place to see the polar bears?
Oh yes, well, I mean, obvious bias here as somebody who loves Churchill, but we do know that Churchill is one of the best places to see polar bears, in that while we have a smaller population here, and our population in Churchill is 800 bears and change, right? It's not a small population of bears. There's still quite a few polar bears out there. What we know about that area is that as we look at all those polygons for where bears are located around the northern hemisphere, that they're very, very big areas, just like it is for the Western Hudson Bay population. But with the Western Hudson Bay population, we know really well where they aggregate before the ice comes, and that they aggregate quite fully. So we don't have 800 bears who come exactly around Churchill, but we have a lot of bears who very reliably turn up in the Churchill region before the ice comes on. And we simply don't have that same reliability in many other places for polar bear viewing. A lot of places, and some people may have seen polar bears, on a ship through the Northwest Passage, or, on a ship past Svalbard. But for the most part, those are opportunistic sightings, right? You just get lucky and you come across a polar bear. While we're not in the business of guaranteeing polar bears, I would probably eat several hats if you came to Churchill in before the ice freeze up in the fall and didn't encounter multiple bears, because it's simply where the bears are, because it's the best place for the bears to be at that time.
Fascinating. Okay, let's see here. So I know Eddie's going to talk a little bit more, but there's a lot of interest in the whole process of hibernation and being pregnant. So can you just clarify, the bears are pregnant while hibernating, or explain a little bit more about how that happens? And do the pregnant bears, do they drink? Do they do anything while they're hibernating or growing babies? Does that question make sense?
Every time I start counting off how many months it is that these poor pregnant bears have to go without eating, I picture myself and my pregnancies and how
I can't imagine.
20 minutes. So yes, I would love to talk more about those. I won't step on Eddie's toes too much, but I'm happy to clarify. So those pregnant female bears, they're actually not hibernating. We would call it denning, because they're still metabolically active. A lot's still happening. Their body's still doing a lot of things to support that pregnancy. What's happening is when they come off the ice in the spring or the summer, they're going through that period of rest, and then come the fall, their body makes a decision whether or not they're fat enough to implant 1, 2, 3, or possibly 4 blastocysts. So based on how much extra fat she's got at that point, the body goes, oh, I think we can do twins this year, or no, just 1, or whatever it might be. So more fat bear, more cubs. She's then going to move inland into those denning areas, probably go to a den that she's already used, or that her mother used, or that was at least close to where her mother raised her. And she's going to walk around for a bit, get nice and comfortable, and at some point she's just going to crawl inside that den, cuddle up, and remain there for the duration of the gestation of those cubs, which is only about 60 days. So during that gestation period, her only job really is being as calm and relaxed and saving as many calories as possible. She is not hibernating, she is not eating, she is resting, and she is not drinking either. Because she's only able to be pregnant because of the high levels of fat on her body. As fat is metabolized from her body, it actually releases, as you're releasing energy from the fat and breaking those bonds, it actually releases metabolic water. So if all you're doing is metabolizing all the extra fat you've got, you actually don't need to drink, because you're getting enough water just through the fat that you're breaking down. So she's just going to stay in there for the 2 months of her gestation, and then the 2 to 3 months of her nursing those cubs before they are ready to break through and make the journey to the sea ice. So it's a really like biologically speaking, it's fascinating. It's almost like, I think for those of us who have seen what it's like to be pregnant or to be around a pregnant person, you're like, how is this possible? This doesn't seem like a thing that could exist, but yet it does, and they just do it so well. It's one of the main stressors that we have on the polar bear populations, actually, as we're talking about climate change, because as we lose days of ice, 1 or 2 days of ice might not sound like a lot, and 1 or 2 days of ice might not be a lot, but that's 1 or 2 days more that we're stressing the maternal population, because that's another few pounds that she needs to have on for a successful pregnancy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So with all the research that's going on up in the Churchill area, is there a way to log on and follow what's happening and what's being learned?
Yeah, so there are a number of different ways that you can learn about stuff. I mean, there's webinars like this, right? But all of the bear tracking you can find partially online. So WWF does provide relatively up-to-date information on their website as well about collared bears and where you can find them. This is actually a project mainly of the Government of Canada that's subsidized by other projects as well. So you can find it on the Environment Canada website as well with a little bit of digging. But that is publicly available information about where those bears are at any given time, the ones that have collars. If you travel with NatHab, one of the things that we try to do is integrate a lot of the current science into into the learning that we do and the travel that we do. And in Churchill, one of the ways that that's supported is through organizations like WWF, like Polar Bears International, and like the Churchill Northern Studies Center that hosts a lot of these researchers as well. So we're always bringing in whatever up-to-date new information we can into our webinars, into our tours, and into any talks that we give along the way.
Got it. So I think we just have time for one last question. This is a loaded one.
Oh boy.
So with the polar bears hanging around Churchill for such an extended period of time, was there a lot of human bear interaction or conflict, or any way to encapsulate that relationship?
Yeah, and you know, I don't want to speak for the people of Churchill because everybody's going to have their own feelings around bears and their own interactions with bears. But I know, speaking with a number of people from Churchill in the fall, like right before tourism season was done, they were worried a little bit about the fact that the ice wasn't in yet, because once the tourism season is done, Churchill is still there. And while Churchill has a really robust response system to dealing with bears, it's also a very long season, and it can get really exhausting for people. If you're on call to deal with every polar bear that wanders into town for a 6-week period, and then that 6-week period drags into a 10-week period, and there's still polar bears wandering into town while the school kids are trying to unload off the bus, it gets tiring. So even now, because we still have a number of bears that we know are on land, the folks who work for Manitoba Conservation who deal with those bears and who are managing those interactions, they are still on call at this point. They're not on their 24-hour-a-day cycles anymore, but they still know that they might need to be called out at any point. Now, I did not hear of any negative interactions happening this year beyond the odd like bear wandering into town, which happens every year. Like I said, Churchill has an incredibly robust response system for how they deal with bears before they have a chance to become problem bears. And we could talk for a very long time about what that system looks like. But Churchill's response is all about reducing that conflict where we can, managing that conflict where it happens, and not giving it the opportunity to happen again. So any bear that kind of looks like it's going to go that way is removed from the situation and often kind of rehomed to an area maybe 50 or 60 kilometers away where it can't easily come back into town. So there weren't any really negative interactions that I've heard of this year. They were all managed really well, like I would expect from those really incredibly dedicated people at Manitoba Conservation with the Polar Bear Alert Program. And I think it's been a very successful though longer than anticipated, polar bear season for those bears on the ground.
Excellent. Well, that's all we have time for today. To those of you who submitted questions about the babies and mamas, please do join us tomorrow because you will have more time to discuss those topics. But thanks again for today, Eleanor. This was fascinating. And I just want to turn it back to you for any last comments, any closing comments.
Thanks. I just want to thank everybody for coming in today, and I hope you show up tomorrow for the polar bear cubs as well. I know we're all here because we love polar bears, and I think they're just such a beautiful, fascinating, otherworldly animal, and I very much hope that if you haven't had a chance to see them in person, that someday you will.
All right. Well, thanks again for tuning in, and do join us tomorrow for the next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful day.